From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. Chief Washington correspondent Kevin Cirilli is at the White House right now. We want to talk with him about those elections yesterday, but first, we have to turn to that Reuters report. Just out, just a few minutes ago, the U.S.-China trade deal, if there's going to be one, may have to wait until December. So, Kevin, this is a Reuters report, but certainly the markets did not like it.
No, they didn't like it at all. And in fact, markets reacting on that news that President Trump might not get to finalize or sign that phase one trade agreement of the U.S.-China trade deal until December. Remember, a key part of that phase one agreement is that potentially those tariffs that are set to go in effect on billions of dollars worth of Chinese imports into the United States would be off the table in mid-December, December 15th. But Reuters reporting that, well, scheduling conflicts might have to prevent President Trump and President Xi from actually getting together to sign the deal. Originally, they had planned to sign it at an economic summit in Chile. That, of course, was postponed indefinitely due to the protests. Then President Trump, within the last week, circulating, David, that potentially they would sign that U.S.-China trade agreement phase one in Iowa or Alaska, Hawaii even, or somewhere in China. But Reuters again reporting that as of now, really they might have to wait until December.
Yeah, and it's not just the December 15 tariffs. Yesterday, there were reports that actually it might be that they'd roll back the September ones, although reportedly the United States was going to ask for more from the Chinese. So I wonder whether it's scheduling problems or whether actually there's more to the deal that's yet to be done.
No, I've talked with several sources who are working with the White House in terms of negotiating with the Chinese, and what they indicate is that this has been an incredibly volatile negotiation, to put it mildly. In addition to the key aspects relating to access in financial services industries in China, agricultural purchases have also been something on the negotiating table, with China saying that they would be open to purchasing more agricultural products from the U.S. But let's also not lose sight of some of the more contentious issues, including intellectual property theft.
Yeah, and intellectual property was specifically something that came up in connection with the possible rollback of September 1. There were some reports coming out of the White House that, in fact, they were saying, okay, Chinese, you want to roll back to September 1, those December 1 tariffs, then you're going to have to give us more intellectual property. And we know that's a real sticking point with the Chinese. They say because they might need legislation to get it done.
Exactly. And beyond that, it's one area in which the president enjoys bipartisan support on Capitol Hill. And it really pushes back against the Chinese narrative that President Xi would be able to outlast the Trump administration, whether it be for another year or another 5 years, in the sense that Republicans and Democrats in Washington, D.C. have been incredibly critical of Beijing for how they've handled the issue of intellectual property.
Okay, great reporting from the White House. That's our chief Washington correspondent, Kevin Cirilli. Thanks so much, Kevin. Welcome now, Republican Senator Mike Braun of Indiana. He's joining us from Capitol Hill. So, Senator, we had a lot to talk to you about before this happened, but let's turn to this report from Reuters that, in fact, any signing of a first phase agreement with the U.S. and China might be rolled until December. Do you know anything about that?
I just saw the news flash a moment ago, but it doesn't surprise me. I think the Chinese have been doing the two-step on the whole negotiating process from the point when it was going to get inked, so many months ago. They're, I think, calculating this politically back home. I think their economy is probably as weak as it has been. We do it from a position of strength where they're more dependent on us than we are on them. And when it comes to anything concrete, I believe you're going to find them kind of fishtailing on getting it on paper. And even if they do put something on paper, I would make sure we're verifying, because they've shown us that they're not negotiating in good faith in my mind. And that's because I really think they're still calculating to try to do this two-step right into the November 2020 elections.
So, Senator, as you say, the U.S. economy is doing at least okay despite what's going on with tariffs. I mean, it had been doing better. It's come off a little bit, but it's doing okay. But at the same time, we have not really hit the consumers as much yet. And we do have a deadline of December 15. Are you worried about the economy overall, or for that matter, your constituents back in Indiana, if those tariffs go on consumer goods just before Christmas, I might add?
I mean, that could end up creating a glitch of some sort. But as a Main Street entrepreneur, what was what occurred back in December of 2017 with the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. That's been what's driving the economy. I think that's solely responsible for why we haven't slipped into poorer economic performance. That's the one significant difference that was not in place for decades leading up to it. And I think that underlies the strength in our economy. I'm more worried about that getting derailed if the other agenda takes place here, which hopefully does not occur through November of 2020. This is the best economy, and I've been at it for 38 years, for Main Street America, to where finally LLCs, sub-S's, the job producers are healthy and thriving. And that's what puts us in a strong bargaining position with China.
So I'm going to make a guess that the other agenda you're talking about is that impeachment inquiry. I think that's what you're talking about, sir. Are you suggesting, in effect, if that goes forward the way the Democrats want, that that could interfere with U.S. economic performance?
I mean, not only that, but the policy agenda that stretches from the Green New Deal, Medicare for all, free college tuition. Let's maybe get rid of the Electoral College. That kind of stuff, I think, is going to really resonate, especially when the economy keeps doing well. I think it'll do well generally through the election. And I think that's when all the craziness when it comes to driving a partisan impeachment inquiry that occurred from the day President Trump got elected back in November of 16 to all the things they're talking about if they do take the reins over. There's no way we could pay for it. I guarantee you it would tank the economy from day one.
We're talking with Senator Mike Braun, Republican of Indiana. Senator, we've talked about the U.S.-China trade deal if it gets done. Let's talk about the other big trade issue up there in Capitol Hill, which is the USMCA, that successor to NAFTA. We talked actually just last Friday with Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and this is what she said. She said basically she had to have a majority of her caucus go with her to go forward. Listen to what she said.
It's about having agreement on the trade agreement. It all springs from what is in the trade agreement. I have gone in the past to the floor with a minority of my members, but that's not what this is. This is about a policy that we are establishing that isn't, again, let's just to pass it, we'll pass something less than has true enforcement in it.
So, Senator Braun, that's the Speaker of the House saying she wants at least a majority of her caucus. And specifically on the enforcement side, is she going to get it? When are we going to get that USMCA approved?
I think she could do this immediately, and she might be laying the blame on her caucus. I can guarantee you that there are enough blue state ag congressmen that need this across the line, along with manufacturing across the country. Her caucus is for getting this passed. She's playing political footsie with it because I think she's afraid it'll be a feather in President Trump's cap, and I think they're going to pay a political price for dragging their feet. She's orchestrating it. She can lay the blame more broadly on the caucus. I don't think that's the case. She is measuring this along with the impeachment inquiry in a calculated way that I think deny President Trump anything leading into the 2020 election.
When we're talking about paying potential political prices, let's talk about the appropriations that are not getting done. We increased the debt ceiling, but we're not got the money appropriated yet, as I understand it. And we're coming up against another deadline here. If, in fact, we end up shutting the government, would it be over the wall? And if so, who gets the blame for that?
First of all, I believe that we should not shut the federal government down through these negotiations. Republicans always get left holding the bag on it. Somehow, politically, it's our fault. But yes, we're not getting any of that done. I was really involved and did a lot in the private sector of reforming health care, created a great plan for my own company. All that is on the shelf. That's still the biggest issue out here, the cost of health care. But none of that is moving, and the impeachment inquiry is now occupying the limited calendar space that was there to begin with. So I think there will be a political accountability for that as well. But no, we're not getting any of the things most Hoosiers, most Americans expect us to do because we're focusing on other stuff.
Okay, Senator Braun, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to have you with you. Appreciate your time. That's Senator Mike Braun, Republican from Indiana. And now let's get a check on the markets. And we ask every day how the markets are reacting to world events. I think today maybe there's an answer.
You're right about that. We have something to talk about here. We certainly have a reaction to that Reuters headline about the possibility that China and the U.S. will not sign that phase one trade deal until December. Again, just a Reuters headline. Relative to the reaction from the markets, you asked a key question to Kevin Cirilli, and that is whether or not this is a matter simply of scheduling in place, or does this tell us that there's more negotiating going on? Right now, the fact that the markets are down so little probably suggests it's more scheduling. That being said, David, the Japanese yen, a haven asset, and bonds are also rallying. So you have a stealth rally going on for those haven assets, telling you that some traders are perhaps a little bit concerned. Plus, let's face it, a delayed deal is a delayed deal, not as good as a signed deal.
So besides trade, what else is weighing on the markets or lifting the markets on the matter? Because the markets overall are doing quite well these days.
Yeah, they're doing very well. This year, the S&P 500 up more than 20%, on pace for its best year since 2013. So the bulls very much in charge. And on the day, probably the big story is HPQ and Xerox. It's said that Xerox is interested in taking a bid, buying out HPQ. What makes this so interesting, of course, it puts together two former tech stars. But HPQ is the huge company, $30 billion in market cap. Xerox much smaller, but Carl Icahn has really helped to turn around Xerox. New board, new CEO, plus Fujifilm, some of those assets, partnerships divested.
So this is how live news works. The headline just crossed a few moments ago. Xerox has bid for HP. And it's valued at something less than $23 a share. And we knew that it might be coming down, but now they have bid, in fact, for HP, which is a fascinating story because it's two companies who have been tech companies, somewhat on the wane, I think it's fair to say.
Yes.
Now saying, let's get together. Maybe
so they're trying
2 + 2
to combine.
= 5.
That's exactly right. And the big deal here would be the idea of cost synergies, $2 to $3 billion in cost synergies. You're right. These are two hardware companies in a time where software and some of these internet companies are doing so much better. So you put the two of them together, they save $2 or $3 billion. You have some smart folks behind the scene. Again, I was just mentioning Carl Icahn, and the two companies can come together. And here we see HPQ. At the highs, it had been up 18% at that point, on pace for its best day since 1980, but still right now up 10%. And I'm just reading this headline myself.
Xerox is up as well. It's interesting. You don't always have the acquired and the acquirer both go up.
And that tells you that investors like the idea, traders like the idea of these two hardware, I don't want to say dinosaurs, but again, old school companies coming together. They can save some money together and create some sort of a hardware giant and have a better time of it
Xerox
together.
has a little cash because they got out of that Fuji deal, right? They got bought out of the Fuji deal. So they got a little money to work with.
No trial. And it's also said that they have financing from Citi. So.
There you go. Okay, many thanks to Abigail Doolittle for that report on the markets. Coming up, Prime Minister Boris Johnson is headed toward an election, but he seems to be having some difficulties holding together his own party. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. We turn now to Ritika Gupta for Bloomberg First Word News.
Thanks, David. The meeting between President Trump and China's Xi Jinping to sign phase one of their trade deal could be delayed until December. That's according to Reuters. A senior White House official says Iowa is now unlikely to be the venue for the ceremony. Sweden and Switzerland reportedly are under consideration. Meanwhile, the House of Representatives will begin public impeachment hearings on President Trump next week. House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff made the announcement today. 3 House panels have been interviewing witnesses in private over the last few weeks. Amongst them is former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch. Her public hearing is scheduled for November 15th. New York City's retiring police commissioner won't have much time off before starting his new job. James O'Neill will join Visa next month as its new senior vice president and global head of physical security. O'Neill announced his departure from the NYPD Monday. He said he'd be leaving on November 30th for an unspecified private sector job, calling it, quote, something I couldn't pass up. Global news, 24 hours a day on air and at TikTok on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Ritika. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson launched his campaign for re-election by going to visit the Queen today. But he's already suffered a setback, and that was when a member of his cabinet, the Secretary for Wales, was forced to resign. Welcome now to Therese Raphael of Bloomberg Opinion, coming to us from London. So, Therese, it's not just that. He also had to apologize, basically, for Jacob Rees-Mogg making some infelicitous comments. It's not going so well for him so far.
Yeah, it's been a rough start for the Prime Minister. First, you had Jacob Rees-Mogg suggesting that the victims and survivors of the Grenfell Tower fire, the horrific fire a few years ago that resulted in so many deaths, were somehow responsible. Then you have, I think, the first ministerial resignation during a campaign since 1974, which also complicates the Conservatives' attempt to win seats in Wales. This was a Welsh secretary who resigned. So it has been a rough start. That said, Johnson is ahead of the polls, and he's really trying to now shift the focus onto Parliament, which he blames for failing to allow a Brexit to be delivered, and onto opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn, whom he likened to Stalin in an op-ed piece, in which he said that Corbyn's disdain for the private sector and wealth creation was similar to the Soviet dictators.
So last time we had a general election called by Theresa May, it didn't go so well for her, but it's thought generally, as I understand it, that Boris Johnson is much more charismatic. Do they have high hopes for his party going into these elections?
Yeah, I think it's such a different scenario on all fronts from 2017. Then you had a prime minister who was, by all accounts, a fairly wooden campaigner. She called an election that she didn't really have to call. She was up against an opposition leader who proved to be quite adept on the campaign trail, but he wasn't very well known. So while Jeremy Corbyn, I'd say, outperformed expectations, Theresa May at the time underperformed expectations, and this is just a very different situation. We now have quite a charismatic, campaign-driven prime minister, a gridlocked parliament, a public that's pretty tired of the Brexit negotiations and quite familiar with Jeremy Corbyn now. So I don't think it's that similar to 2017. That said, we may get a lot of tactical voting. There's already talk about how that might play out. So even though the Conservatives are ahead in the polls quite substantially, I wouldn't say this is predictable by any means.
Yeah, and whatever you might call Boris Johnson, you wouldn't call him wooden. That's the one sure thing we know for sure. Many thanks to Therese Raphael of Bloomberg Opinion reporting today from London. I want to turn from London now to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Aramco got a potential boost in its IPO with news that China is at least contemplating buying between $5 and $10 billion worth of its stock. Welcome now, Dinesh Nair, who covers deals for Bloomberg over in London. So this is a big leg up, right, for an IPO that maybe was a little troubled because the valuations were coming down.
Yes, David. Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me. Yes, this is indeed quite a big boost for Saudi Arabia and Aramco if the Chinese end up picking up to like $10 billion of the Aramco IPO. Obviously, this comes there's not just as a commercial kind of decision for either parties. It's also quite political. China is trying to build inroads into the Middle East, and Saudi Arabia is one of its key partners to kind of develop its relations in the Middle East. For Aramco, Asia is one of its key markets. So if you can convince one of its key customers to put in big money into the IPO, it'll be a big win for them.
Well, when the Crown Prince first went out with this, he talked about a valuation something like $2 trillion. That's come down now. A lot of banks are down significantly south of $2 trillion. But with potential interest from the Chinese, and also, as I understand, the Russians have said some nice things about it as well. Could that valuation go back up toward the $2 trillion mark that Mohammed bin Salman promised?
Yes. So from the very beginning, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has been keen on getting a valuation of at least $2 trillion, which was seen as quite ambitious by several investors. But as we understand, Saudi Arabia has come down a bit on their valuation expectations. We think they're now looking at potentially raising money at a valuation of about 1.6 to 1.8 trillion. which is still quite high, and even at that number, the dividend yield of Aramco is likely to be lesser than some of the other oil majors. But if they can get this kind of money from the Chinese and the Russians, obviously that kind of puts the whole situation in a different play, and they could potentially get closer to that mark. But as of now, it looks like $2 trillion is still quite an ambitious number.
Okay, thank you so much for that great reporting from London. That's Bloomberg's Dinesh Nair. Still ahead, CVS shares are higher today after posting a healthy earnings report. It's our stock of the hour. It's next, and this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. Time now for the stock of the hour. CVS Health is heading for its best day since August, rallying more than 4% after the company raised its 2019 profit forecast. It also posted a strong performance in the pharmacy benefits business. That's the PBM business, as we call it. Kaylee Lyons is here to explain it all to us.
Yeah, well, of course, that PBM business is called Caremark, and it's especially interesting to me because it's doing really well. In this quarter, it saw revenues up about 6.4%, and in part that was due to just higher claims. Those were up about 9.3%. But then the other part was higher drug prices because, as we know, they negotiate those prices with drug makers for their clients, which includes insurers. And it's interesting because that drug price debate we know has been running hot and heavy on Capitol Hill for quite some time now. And a lot of the conversation has been about PBMs, the role they play in this, yet they seem to be doing well despite that.
Well, and Senator Grassley's had a series of hearings going after it, saying basically they're doing too well. You say Caremark's doing well. He's concerned they're doing too well because they're an intermediary and they get a lot of money. They make a lot of money, high margins. Yeah,
a lot of kickbacks, and as a result, they really have been in the spotlight. But what's interesting is Larry Merlo, the CVS CEO, addressed this on the call with analysts. He said that the debate actually seems to be shifting less so from the PBMs, more toward manufacturers, why the list prices of these drugs are what they are. Now, you can kind of take that as you will. That's what the company is saying. But nonetheless, they do have their raised revenue guidance for this business for the full year, and they're also raising their earnings guidance. So it looks like the picture for that PBM business could be a little stronger going forward.
If Larry Merlo's right, it'd be good news for Larry Merlo.
Right.
I suspect the manufacturers might have a different point of view.
Right.
In the meantime, there's also been news about Walgreens and Boots, that in fact there might be a move to take it private. Where does that stand?
Doesn't really stand anywhere as of right now. This actually hasn't happened. Bloomberg reported yesterday they're looking into a possible leverage buyout, and it would be the largest ever. But because it would be the largest ever, I mean, we're talking like $75 billion. That's more than double the second largest deal that would be of this size. And the street just really doesn't see it's probable. In theory, maybe, but when you actually look at the numbers, Deutsche Bank says the math just doesn't work on this. So you're seeing those shares underperform today as a result. But as we know, it also has been underperforming CVS in the longer term.
Well, that's what I was going to say. If you just look at the two companies, CVS does better than Walgreens Boots for whatever reason.
Well, their strategies seem to be working a little more. Walgreens has tilted a lot more toward partnerships, where CVS is doing things like buying out Aetna and focusing more toward that health insurance business. So those two different tacks are kind of taking them on two different paths, at least for the time being.
Great report. Thank you so much, Kaylee. I learned from that, that's for sure. Okay, many thanks to Bloomberg's Kaylee Lyons. Up next, depositions continue behind closed doors on Capitol Hill, even as Republicans continue to call it all unfair and blatantly political. We ask our political panel whether it's right. And that's coming up next. This is Bloomberg Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. From New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Ritika Gupta.
Thanks, David. A surprise drop in U.S. productivity last month. It's the first time that's happened in almost 4 years. Output per hour decreased at an annual rate of 0.3% in the third quarter. That suggests a pickup in efficiency earlier this year was more of a temporary shift. In San Francisco, voters agreed to move ahead with a ban on e-cigarettes. Earlier this year, officials passed a law to prevent anyone from buying nicotine vaporizers until the products get FDA approval. The biggest e-cigarette maker, Juul, led an effort to overturn the law. More than 80% of those who voted rejected that attempt. And multiple lawmakers in Puerto Rico are under arrest in connection with a corruption probe in the U.S. territory. FBI agents today took a senator and 7 other people into custody. The U.S. Attorney's Office says the suspects include former municipal employees who were indicted on allegations of theft or bribery involving programs that receive federal funds. Russia is set to deliver a sophisticated anti-aircraft missile system to Serbia. This after the US warned of possible sanctions against the Balkan country in the event of such purchases. Serbia remains a key ally of Russia, even though it wants to join the European Union. Belgrade has pledged to stay out of NATO and refused to join Western sanctions against Russia over the conflict in eastern Ukraine. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at TikTok on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks very much, Ritika. The number 3 State Department official has been giving testimony behind closed doors today in front of the House Intelligence Committee chaired by Adam Schiff. And the hearings will start going public next week, according to Mr. Schiff in a tweet. We welcome now our political panel of Kirsten Hahn. She is Democratic strategist and senior advisor to ROKK Solutions. She comes to us today from Washington. And the Reverend Joe Watkins. He's senior consultant with Causeway Strategies, and he's former aide to President George Herbert Walker Bush. Reverend Watkins comes to us from the city of Philadelphia. So, Kristen, let me start with you. As a Democratic strategist, does the fact that Adam Schiff say we're going to go public mean that basically he's concluding his part of the investigation? He knows what he needs to know?
I mean, they've had significant, and by the way, the fact that it's going public and the whole, hoopla that the Republicans, made up a couple of weeks ago about not being included in the hearings, which was, blatantly false. I'm not sure if he's concluded what he needs to know, but I do think it's important, and Congressman Schiff knows this, that the public needs to be aware and to be privy and to see what's going on. So I think it's a public move. It's smart on his part, and it's yet to be seen whether the general public, what we're seeing in a lot of these tough districts, and I work with a lot of the moderate Democrats in the House, is that people really don't know as much as you and I and everybody else who's paying attention to this every day know. So I think it could be a positive development, but it's yet to be seen whether voters in these swing districts, independent voters, center-right voters, this is really resonating with them.
So Joe, what about what Kristen just said? Because it does seem like they call it, some people call it the Republican wall has been holding really pretty firm. We're not talking about this. It's ridiculous. It's a witch hunt, the president says. At the same time, if you look across the country, the polling now is up to, I think, something like 49% of people think not only should there be impeachment, but he actually ought to be driven from office.
Well, yeah, it really depends on who you ask and how you ask that question. Certainly, from the standpoint of Democrats, a majority, probably 80% plus of Democrats, would care to see the president impeached and removed from office. That is those that want to see him impeached. And then for Republicans, it would be the opposite of that. It would probably be 80+% don't wish to see him impeached and removed from office. And so I think that Democrats are wise to have a sober recitation of the facts, a sober discovery of the facts. Nancy Pelosi has been very sober in her delivery, saying that she takes no joy in this and that she is just trying to do her job and get to the bottom of it. That's probably the best way for Democrats to have any chance of moving the numbers in the direction they wish to see it go. But right now, the Republican wall is firm and is likely not to change anytime soon.
So, Kristen, put together two things that actually Speaker Pelosi does not want to put together, which is the politics of the election year next year with the impeachment inquiry. She says that they're entirely separate things. But to what extent does one spill over another? And does it help Democrats or hurt Democrats as this drags out?
So generally, I think, the way I think about it, it's hurtful to certain Democrats. It's hurtful, I think, in the long term, the longer this drags out. If you're looking at, independent and center-right voters in these tough districts where Democrats that we need in order to keep the House, I think ultimately it's probably hurtful for them. However, we are seeing in polls, district by district polls in some of these districts that we're not as far underwater as we thought we were on the issue of impeachment. That said, I do understand where the speaker's coming from, and people are voting. They're still voting on very local issues. They are voting on the issue of health care and jobs. So I think that you'll see a lot of the members in these tougher districts, particularly in the House and also in the Senate, really trying to focus locally on the issues and away from impeachment.
We're talking with our political panel of Joe Watkins and Kristen Hahn. So, Joe, let's come back to you on these elections we had yesterday. We had some state and local results. Particularly, let's focus on, for the moment, Kentucky. We're not sure yet on the governor, but it looks like a Democrat has taken that away from a Republican in the state of Kentucky. Not quite official. But then Virginia, for the first time in over 25 years, you have both houses of the legislature, both being Democrat. How important is that?
These are important numbers to watch. Certainly, the fact that both houses in Virginia have gone to the Democrats really is something for Republicans to take note of, especially as 2020 approaches, because Virginia is such an important state. But right now, it's a blue state, at least given what happened last night. Kentucky, not so easy to say yet. Kentucky, of course, you see, it looks like the Republican governor will lose his seat to the Democrat. But at the same time, you had a black Republican who won statewide office as Attorney General for the first time in probably 60 or 70 years. That is the first time a Republican has been elected statewide an Attorney General, and certainly the first African American to hold that seat. This African American, by the way, is a former aide to Mitch McConnell, who has not had high numbers with regards to approval, but nonetheless, this bodes well for Mitch McConnell. It's a helpful sign to Mitch McConnell as he looks toward 2020.
Joe, do the Republicans have a problem growing in the suburbs? I mean, even in your hometown of Philadelphia?
Yes. Yes, Republicans have to be very, very careful about the message and the tone of the message. Consider the fact that America is becoming a more brown country and a more diverse place. People want to hear about lower taxes and less regulation, but they want to also make sure that you take into consideration the fact that this is a more diverse country. And in the state of Pennsylvania, Republicans have now lost Delaware County, right outside of Philadelphia, a very, very important county, a county that just several years ago was a very solidly Republican county. That is now a Democrat county.
Kristen, final thought from you. In 2000, President George W. Bush, then governor, won with compassionate conservatism. Do the Republicans have a problem here because they don't have much compassion with their conservatism?
I do think so. I think that and I'm not a Republican strategist by any means, but, going back, and I am from the state of Texas, so, I think that message of compassionate conservatism could really, the Republicans could take advantage of something like that right now. They really have a problem. It's pretty much the opposite than that with President Trump. The one thing I would just take a quick look at when you're looking at the Kentucky governor's race, yes, very unpopular. One thing I'm taking note of, though, is coal country in the rural districts where that went for, Trump took by 50%, and Bashir won those narrowly, but won them. So I'm kind of taking those interesting kind of pieces from the state and looking at what that means for 2020.
Okay, many thanks to our political panel of Joe Watkins and Kristen Hahn. Coming up, we talk with Mayor Randall Woodfin of Birmingham, Alabama, about the economy and governing as a progressive in a red state. That's next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. Randall Woodfin was sworn in as the 30th mayor of Birmingham, Alabama 2 years ago, and he bills himself as a progressive leader in a very conservative state. We welcome Mayor Woodfin now to Bloomberg for today's Conversation in Chief. Mr. Mayor, thank you for coming here.
Hey, happy to be on.
Let's start with some basics for those of us who don't know, perhaps, your city well enough. What's the economic state of your city right now?
Well, the city of Birmingham is the largest city in the state of Alabama. And from a GDP standpoint, we make up 31% of the GDP for the entire state. And so our economy drives the state. Yes, I'm happy to report that our unemployment rate is only 3.1%. But there's a more important number that I look at, which is how many Birminghamians are actually employed. And too many of our citizens have just totally tapped out of the labor market, even trying to find employment. But since I've been in office, I'm glad to say that number is ticking up as far as Birminghamians being employed, which is geared towards that 3.1% going down. But we always have to remember the city of Birmingham's population, like many other cities, probably including New York, it doubles during the daytime, which means a lot of that is driven by people coming outside of the city to have some of these jobs. We, and in my position as mayor, have to make sure that residents who live in the city also have gainful employment.
So President Trump came to office about a year before you did, and he wanted pro-growth policies, pro-jobs policies. To what extent has what he's done in his administration helped you? Has it been relevant to the people who live in Birmingham, Alabama?
Birmingham, Alabama has a post-industrial economy, and we're moving towards a knowledge-based economy. That means we're in support of innovation and economic opportunities around startups. In my position, what we have tried to do is totally recreate how we engage and encourage business to grow and develop in the city of Birmingham, where we're not necessarily always looking at land, how incentives were done in the past, but we look at actually what our employers and what these small business owners need from an employment standpoint, investing in their workforce. And so the type of incentives we've started to lay out and present for a potential person to come to our city is how can we support your workforce gaps? I can't tell you necessarily what the president has done in the past. What I can tell you is that we're laser focused on making sure we have an economy that works for all residents who live in Birmingham.
You are a progressive
Absolutely.
in what I said is a pretty Republican state. If you look at Donald Trump, he did very well in that state last time as a state, maybe not in Birmingham, but as a state overall. How does that work? I mean, what drives your campaign? What drives your administration? Is it economics? Is it social? What drives voters to you in Birmingham?
Well, I like to remind people that the city of Birmingham is a blueberry and tomato soup as it relates to being in the state of Alabama. And in that regards, it's important that we are progressive. It's important that I remind people that in Birmingham, we believe women's rights are human rights. It's important that we let people know we're open for business, that on whether it's social or on the economic side, that we have to drive a progressive agenda for all people that live in our city. In that regards, again, going back to the social aspects of this, there's some things that have taken place at the state level that the city of Birmingham has not agreed with, and so we have to push our economic agenda harder. And
we're speaking with Birmingham, Alabama Mayor Randall Woodfin. I just want to make sure exactly who we're talking to. How do you make your city really hospitable to business? I mean, because typically we think about tax incentives, things like that. How do you make it a good place for businesses to come to and stay in?
Well, the first thing we want to remind people in the city of Birmingham is that we are open for business. The second thing is that from around incentives, with a knowledge-based economy, those incentives aren't necessarily geared towards place. They're more now geared towards how do you invest in their workforce. And so we've created various incentive packages that allow an employer or a small business or one of those startups to receive an incentive, a tax rebate based on the investments we've made and they make in their actual personnel, which includes hiring locally. Our entire responsibility at this point, in my position as mayor and my economic development team, is to let small businesses know, not just the existing businesses in Birmingham, but across America, that they can be successful in Birmingham, because we created an ecosystem where we support them, where we lock arms with them and make sure we help them leverage capital.
So you're mayor of a significant city. Mayors have a particular role because they have to get stuff done.
Yes, sir.
We have another mayor who's running for president right now, Pete Buttigieg.
Yes, sir.
Do you know him? What do you think of him?
I met Pete probably January of 2018. We sat at a breakfast. He let me know he was running. And he's a part of a cohort of other mayors across the nation where we're having these conversations about our role and responsibility as far as if we can't get it from the federal level, if we can't get it from the state level, then it's incumbent upon mayors to really drive economic growth in these cities and invest in infrastructure and these social justice issues as well. I think Pete, like many of the other Democratic presidential candidates, are making their mark by really saying and communicating to everyday residents in America how and why the White House should be different. And so I think what he's doing and other candidates are doing is a great job.
And the policies that he espouses so far, at least, do they resonate with you as a mayor of Birmingham, saying, look, if we had a president in the White House that did that, that would help me in Birmingham?
I think the policies that Mayor Pete is talking about and many of the other presidential candidates are talking about, I like many of their policies. I think many of their policies not only speak to me in my position as mayor, but I think about my own mother, who is an African-American woman that's 64. What are her issues? What is she concerned about? And I think for all the presidential Democratic candidates, they need to stay tuned to who makes up the base of the Democratic Party. And in particular, they need to pay closer attention to the South, because although we respect what's going to happen in Iowa and New Hampshire, whatever happens in South Carolina, the same thing will happen in Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi and Louisiana.
Okay, many, many thanks to Mayor of Birmingham, Randall Woodfin. And we're going to have more with the mayor coming up at 1 o'clock this afternoon on radio. Coming up, Democrats win back control of Virginia's state government for the first time in decades. Do last night's election results spell disaster for Republicans in the suburbs? We ask Larry Sabato next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
If you lose, it sends a really bad message. It just sends a bad, and they will build it up. Here's the story. If you win, they're going to make it like ho-hum. And if you lose, they're going to say Trump suffered the greatest defeat in the history of the world. This was the greatest. You can't let that happen to me.
That was President Trump speaking at a rally in Lexington, Kentucky on Monday. But the president's campaigning doesn't appear to have been enough for Governor Matt Bevin to get reelected. And in Virginia, Democrats captured both houses of the legislature for the first time since 1993. Take us through the results. Welcome now from Charlottesville, Virginia, Larry Sabato, the director of the University of Virginia Center for Politics and the editor-in-chief of Crystal Ball. So, Larry, great to have you back with us. Let's take it through. First of all, in Kentucky, it looks like, it's not official yet, looks like Mr. Bevin lost his position as governor. Does it tell us anything more broadly?
Well, I think it is an embarrassment for President Trump. He predicted it himself on Monday, and it's the logical thing to say. After all, he chose Kentucky for election eve. Normally, you pick something on election eve where you think you're really going to make the difference and therefore will get credit for it. Well, he miscalculated. Now, look, it's possible that Bevin would have lost by more had Trump not appeared. I don't know. No one could know that based on the polling that I've seen, at least. But you either win or lose in politics. The rest of it's explanation.
Yeah, that seems about right. But in the meantime, in Mississippi, the president had something more win, right? He campaigned on behalf of the Republican candidate who won.
Yeah, that's true, but it was by single digits. Mississippi is about as heavily Republican as you're going to find. And Trump, I believe, won by somewhere around 17 percentage points. Most Republican candidates win in the double digits. Well, this governor-elect did not. It was single digits, I think around 6%, something like that.
And in Virginia, it seems to be almost historic. As I said, I think since 1993, they haven't had both houses of the legislature and the governor all be Democrat. What does that say about Virginia? Is it turning from a purple state into just an outright blue state?
Oh, I think it's been bluish, I've been saying for several years. This accelerated in the new century, and especially since 2008, when Barack Obama became the first Democrat since Lyndon Johnson to win Virginia in a presidential contest. And the Republicans haven't won a single statewide election since 2009. They've lost everything, both U.S. Senate seats, governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, a majority of the U.S. House delegation, now both houses of the state legislature. There's nothing left to lose.
So, Larry, the question I think on a lot of people's minds is, do those elections yesterday tell us anything about what happens in 2020? We want to try to draw a correlation. And one question is, to what extent do some of the policies being espoused by Democratic candidates for president right now infect some of the elections? We had actually Governor Bevin, appears to be about to be former Governor Bevin of Kentucky, actually go after universal health coverage. This is part of what he said.
This is a real battle, and I think the president is saying that one size does not fit all. Universal coverage is a pipe dream. It really is.
So is that resonating with voters? Are people getting nervous and maybe voting for Republicans because they're worried about not even Medicare for all, but universal coverage?
Well, if they are, we didn't see it yesterday. That doesn't mean it wouldn't happen in 2020 if it's a major focus of the presidential race. Actually, I think the election results, the off-year results, reinforce the idea that Obamacare is still quite popular. That's what Democrats should be stressing. They may or may not want to go further than that, but first they need to make sure that Obamacare is stressed because it benefits them.
But this is a key issue, isn't it, for the Democratic Party going into this election? And when we talk about the presidential positions, because you have a couple of candidates who are right up there in the lead saying we want to do essentially away with the Affordable Care Act. We want to go with Medicare for all. And when we talked to Nancy Pelosi, for example, it was clear she's a bit anxious about what that does to her come the election in 2020.
That was an important signal because while Nancy Pelosi is a liberal Democrat, I think she would embrace that label. She's also pragmatic about elections in that she wants to win them. So Democrats usually are pretty well off if they listen to what she's saying because she wants to win. You can only get some of what you want if you win. You can talk about Medicare for all and, for that matter, everything for all. But if you don't win the election, you're going to get nothing for all.
But as a practical matter, given the economy, can President Trump be unseated unless there's a real turnaround in the economy? There are various economic models, as you know, Larry, that say given where we are with growth, doesn't have to be wild, doesn't have to be through the roof, but just solid growth, really low unemployment, really low inflation. In that circumstance, the incumbent wins.
Yeah, that's what the models say, all right. And actually, one of those models and the proponent of it predicted using that model that Hillary Clinton would win easily in 2016. So, you know, if you want to review records of predictions, we all did badly in 2016. And as far as 2020 is concerned, how do you factor in Donald Trump's personality, David? How do you factor that in? Tell me how you do it. Because the truth is, if the economy ran everything, then Democrats should have lost everything in 2018 because there was a very good economy for the midterm elections. Instead, they took over the House and they did pretty well in some governor's races. So people who attempt to model elections based on just one thing or one big category of things usually are wrong.
Sounds like very wise counsel from Larry Sabato. Great to have you with us, Larry. Thanks so much. He's the director of the UVA Center for Politics down in Charlottesville. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to have more with the mayor of Birmingham. Plus, we're going to talk with Cory Booker's campaign manager to see how the New Jersey senator can make inroads in the Democratic presidential race. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.